Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was born before the Nine Tails attacked. Really, how much can small things affect the world? Little things like the color of someone's hair? Their mentor? Maybe, their date of birth? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 5, New Mission. Itachi walked into Naruto's home to a rather unusual sight. The redhead was on his couch, reading through a scroll. That was normal enough, but it was the fact that Anko was kneeling on a footstool behind him, slowly running her hands through his spiky locks with a look of wonder on her face. Itachi watched for about a minute as Anko just kept running her hands through Naruto's hair, breaking apart the laws of physics, defying spikes only for them to reform as soon as her hand passed through. How the hell does it do that? Itachi managed a smirk as he watched the amusing scene, Naruto finally looking up from his scroll at his teammate. "Hey, Itachi." Itachi just nodded as Anko suddenly fell backwards off the stool in surprise, rubbing her head as she glared at the Uchiha. "Damn, do you always have to be so freaking quiet?" Itachi just shrugged. He was a ninja, weren't they supposed to be quiet? Naruto chuckled at the scene, running his hands through his hair once to see if Anko had disturbed it much. They had been happily living together for over 6 months now, officially anyway, with Naruto as Anko's technical legal guardian. They thought it would be pretty strange if she started calling him dad, and they didn't particularly feel like siblings, so they mostly just left their relationship how it was. "It's time for our mission. Ensui-sensei said he had something special planned for us today." Naruto just grinned as he got up, shrugging on his tracksuit jacket and sandals. "See you guys later." Both boys just waved to Anko as they left, sighing slightly as they took to the rooftops to get to the Hokage's tower faster. "Damn, I wish Ensui-sensei would just teach us the Shunshin, it would make getting around a whole lot easier." Itachi just groaned as he picked up the pace, causing Naruto to look at him strangely. "Please don't mention that around Shisui. Ever since he saw Sensei perform that technique, it's all he ever talks about. I swear the day he learns that jutsu is the day I will see somebody happier than when Anko cooked you ramen for your birthday." Naruto looked mock offended but chuckled all the same. That had definitely been a very good day for Naruto. Please, like that could ever happen. Itachi just shrugged, but mentally he had an image of Shisui practically bouncing around the village in joy. They reached the Hokage tower quickly despite lacking that basic Jonin traveling technique, and hurried through the building where they met up with a slightly bored Shisui who had been waiting for them. He just smiled upon seeing them, and the trio walked into the office where they greeted Ensui and the Hokage. A triple call of Hokage-sama followed by polite nods to the Jonin filled the room before both seniors motioned for silence. "So Ensui-sensei, you said you had a surprise for us." The older Nara just nodded slowly, not even bothering to move his face from its usual lazy frown. "Yes, I have been talking with the Hokage about your past mission record and have negotiated you 3 going on a B-ranked mission." The 3 genin just gaped in shock, except Itachi, of course, but inside he was no less surprised. All of a sudden, 2 loud cheers rang out through the room as Shisui and Naruto loudly high-fived one another. The Hokage and Ensui sweat dropped at the action, possibly rethinking the decision after the slightly immature display. However, he too quickly rectified it by turning and bowing to the Hokage quickly. "Thank you Hokage-sama, Ensui-sensei." The older shinobi just sighed. They might act slightly immature at times, but looking back over their records they were undoubtedly qualified. Their missions had all gone without a hitch so far, even the more dangerous C ranks they had been assigned. Each could easily be called a prodigy in their own right, and that included Shisui, who hadn't even unlocked his Sharingan yet. "Alright you guys. Meet me at the gates in 15 minutes. Make sure you pack for a long trip, we don't know how long this will take." After getting a round of nods from his student, Ensui vanished in his shadowy Shunshin, practically making Shisui drool over the technique. Itachi saw this and sighed before dragging his cousin away to pack for their trip. Naruto was also about to leave when he was stopped by the aging Hokage. "Naruto, hold on a moment." Naruto paused on his way out, turning around to the Hokage curiously, only to see a look of concern on the older man's features. "Be careful out there." Naruto's brow furrowed while the rest of his features remained perfectly neutral. Of course, Hokage-sama. With that he left, quietly leaving through the door to get his things from his house and to tell Anko about his mission. As soon as he left, Sarutobi sank back in his chair, sighing deeply as he looked over at Minato's picture, the blonde's face staring right back. He shook his head again as he quickly returned to the stack of paperwork on his large desk. Thanks to their sensei's laziness, it actually took about half an hour before they were leaving the village, but none of them complained. Already used to it after 6 months with the Nara, they let their fantasies on how a B-ranked mission might play out. The 3 genin were conspicuously backpack-free. Ensui began to lecture them on being prepared, but Naruto had quickly interjected that he had made them all a few storage scrolls which were subtly hidden across their bodies. The redhead smirked at his teacher's pleased look before returning to keeping watch over the road that stretched out in front of them. And Yoshino won't stop going on about her little son Shikamaru, really bothersome I tell you. Next thing you know and... The man trailed off as he spoke with Shisui, his eyes furrowing as he glanced around at the trees surrounding the small shinobi group. What is it, sensei? Shisui had caught onto the man's pause, but the jonin recovered, his face returning to its normal apathetic tone. Nothing. I just thought he was cut off as a kunai suddenly shot out from the tree line, only to be intercepted as Naruto dived with an incredible burst of speed. Without even looking, he caught the flying knife midair, throwing it back on exactly the path it had come from. The encounter lasted less than a few seconds before they heard a thump from the forest. The group quickly jogged over to investigate and found a man lying still in a growing pool of his own blood. Ensui tentatively prodded the man with his foot, flipping him over until they could plainly see the kunai sticking out of his chest, right where his heart was. Ensui looked the man over, immediately noting the Iwa headband the man wore as well as the rest of his chunin attire. That made Ensui grimace as he looked around. Not many chunin were stupid enough to take on a full squad with a jonin in. He suspected there might be more of them, so he quickly ordered his team back onto the road. Good work, Naruto. The redhead merely nodded grimly. He didn't exactly enjoy the fact he had killed somebody, morbid thoughts bubbling to the surface. I think now might be a good time to explain the mission, sensei. The older Nara just shook his head as he carried on walking at a lazy, unconcerned pace. Not until we're somewhere I'm sure we won't be spied upon. The genin all just nodded as each unnoticeably picked up their pace in the direction of the next village. None of them saw as the chunin they left dead out in the forest slowly melted into a puddle of mud. Soon after, a much taller, larger man dropped down from the forest, noting the state of his previously hung mud clone with a smirk before taking off after the scent he picked up. All right, sensei. I think we should know the mission details now. Ensui quickly did a scan of the small hotel room to make sure they weren't being listened in on before nodding. Right. We were sent out to protect an important client, a wealthy businessman by the name of Gato. He's beginning to set up business in this area of Fire Country and has been getting harassed by other businessmen in the country. Naruto just frowned at this, sitting down on the bed as it squeaked loudly from Old Springs. That sounds more like a C rank to me. Ensui just nodded as he too took a seat. The lazy man was glad to be off his feet again. Normally you'd be right, but recently the threats have been getting more serious, with even shinobi being mentioned. Gato paid for a B rank, so that's what it is. Itachi just nodded with a small smirk from where he had sat in an old, but still comfortable chair in the corner. I see, so this is really a C-ranked mission, but you wish to add to our records with an easy B rank. Ensui also smirked, however briefly. Easy to figure out then. How bothersome. Shisui and Naruto just smiled, happy that at least the mission wouldn't be as hard as they had thought it might, even if they were excited about being on a B rank. Recently Naruto had been feeling hollow in spars with the two Uchiha. Sure, Itachi could keep him on his toes and even win a few times, but it lacked the danger that made fighting enjoyable for him. Hey sensei, do you mind if we go out and train for a bit? Ensui just nodded as he sank back into the chair, pulling out a scroll to read through. Sure. Just be back before dinner. The redhead nodded as he sent a quick glance at Itachi, who nodded in reply. Quickly, the 3 genin left the room. However, when Shisui rounded the corner of the hallway and he couldn't see Itachi or Naruto anywhere in sight, he instantly threw up his hands, his body tensing. Instantly on guard, he made his way through the rest of the hotel carefully, wondering where his teammates had run to. Soon, he was outside. Then, around the back of the hotel which just bordered a large forest. He was about to call out to his friends but was forced to dodge a kunai that appeared out of nowhere. He ducked into a roll, missing the deadly knife by a few centimeters before standing up and looking around furtively. He turned to the sound of clapping only to watch as a man dropped out of the tree line, still clapping. He was a little taller than the Uchiha, wearing a typical Chunin jumpsuit with scraggly brown hair and an Iwa headband. Impressive Konoha scum, I don't usually miss my targets. Shisui just scowled at the man as he quickly reached for his own pouch, only to realize he had left it in the room when his fingers closed around thin air. The Iwa shinobi just grinned at this as he suddenly rushed forwards at an incredible speed. Shisui could only blink in surprise as he was there 1 minute and in front of him the next. Reacting only on instincts born from fighting Naruto for so long, he diverted a swift punch away from himself and tried to return it with one of his own. However, his attack only met air as the man swiveled around his body, cracking him in the back with a devastating kick that sent him reeling forward. Shisui tried to turn around to face his attacker again only to receive a quick but powerful blow to the back of his neck. The last thing he felt before passing out was his leg being picked up and his body being dragged across the ground in the direction of the forest. Interesting, I was sure your friends would be the first to wake, they put up a much better fight after all. Shisui blinked his eyes open painfully, trying to see anything in the dark that surrounded them in the forest. The words reached him, just as he turned his head in the direction of the voice to come face to face with the man who had attacked him. His eyes widened and he trying to punch the man, but his hands were tied behind him, as well as his feet. What are you talking about? The man just laughed evilly as his eyes flickered to the left and right of his captive. Following his gaze, Shisui saw that Naruto and Itachi were tied up next to him in similar positions, both unconscious. What do you want with us? The man just laughed again as he pulled a kunai out of his pouch, idly picking his nails with it. Shisui blinked in surprise before his eyes hardened angrily. What else? I'm from Iwa, you're from Konoha. I want you to pay for everything you did to us in the Third Shinobi War. Shisui's eyes opened wider again as he struggled in his bindings. What are you talking about? Iwa started the war. The man just snarled angrily as he swiftly kicked Shisui in the stomach, eliciting a small grunt of pain from the genin. Filthy Konoha propaganda, it was your Hokage who declared he war in the first place, our Chuchikage was merely defending out territories. He smirked evilly before he crouched down in front of the boy, their eyes coming together. And now you will die for it. He quickly raised the kunai, the weak sun glinting off the well-polished metal before he began to bring it down, almost lazily. Coward. The kunai halted in midair as the Chunin stared at Shisui in annoyance. What did you call me? Shisui just chuckled, not really seeing much else to do now that he could practically feel his own death coming. I called you a coward, killing your enemy when he's defenseless, tied up and unable to fight back. The man just smiled as he twirled the kunai once into a reverse grip. We're shinobi, kid. Lying, stealing, and cheating is what we do, just a fact of the gruesome world we live in. He quickly brought down the kunai again in one motion, no hesitance this time, and Shisui clenched his eyes shut awaiting the pain that would come. When he didn't feel it, he cracked a single eye open, only to feel the breeze on his now unbound and slightly sore wrists. He quickly jumped to his feet, staring at the man who was happily twirling his kunai around. Fine kid, I was gonna make your death quick, but if you want to go down swinging, I'm all for it. He grinned evilly again as he settled back into a strangely familiar stance with his kunai forward in a reverse grip. Shisui knew he should probably focus on finding a way to get away with his teammates or at least wake them up, but he felt a burning anger towards this shinobi who had insulted his home and hurt his friends. He raced forwards only to be tripped up as the Iwanin sidestepped his attack. The Uchiha wasn't phased though, turning his stumble into an attack as he brought his arms around, trying to strike the man. Once again he was dodged. This time the other shinobi managed to twirl and neatly slice Shisui down his back, making it look like a dance. The Uchiha refused to cry out as he once again attacked, this time ducking low in order to get under the man's guard. Once again it was in vain, he was simply backhanded in the face with a fair bit of force. Right now he just felt like the man was playing with him. He waved around Shisui's attacks with grace and speed, sometimes just making it back in time but dodging all the same. Eventually the man seemed to get bored and viciously kicked the Uchiha in the gut, launching him through the forest of a short collision with a large tree. He groaned before looking up as the Iwa ninja walked closer, once again spinning his kunai in that irritating and cocky manner. Shisui only looked up in anger, unable to properly move his body to dodge or even get up. He could only watch as the shinobi smirked once before raising his kunai up into the air. As he brought it down, Shisui realized a simple fact: he was going to die. The exciting fear of agony pulsed through his veins, making his numb body come alive. He didn't want to leave his family or his friends. There was still so much he wanted to do with his life, like learn the Shunshin and beat Naruto in a spar. As he watched in horror, he could have sworn the kunai slowed down as it arced through the air, like the air had turned to runny treacle. However, he was still unable to move, unable to react in time to stop its downwards descent. He scrunched his eyes shut and simply waited for the finishing blow, hoping it would be painless and quick. However, when that didn't happen for another few moments, he became confused. Did it work? Shisui's eyes opened a crack, and instead of seeing the Iwanin like he thought he would, he instead saw a mop of red hair next to a more controlled mass of jet black hair. I don't know, he has his eyes closed. Shisui opened his eyes fully, looking up at Naruto and Itachi as they looked down at him with curiosity. After a moment of staring, two smiles crept over their faces while Shisui just looked around for any sign of the Iwa ninja. Naruto? Itachi? What happened? Where's the Iwa ninja? The two boys just shared a look. A mutual amusement passed between them, causing Shisui to get concerned. Itachi just shrugged as he leant against a tree, and Naruto adopted the pose that everybody who knew him recognized from when he was embarrassed. There never was an Iwa ninja. Shisui just looked up in confusion, finally getting to his feet despite his slightly aching muscles. What do you mean? I was fighting him and he had you two knocked out. Naruto just chuckled nervously as Itachi smirked, obviously finding it funny. Shisui believed he and Naruto would be knocked out by a single chunin. Yeah, that was a genjutsu. The person you were fighting was me. Shisui just paused for a moment as his gaze flickered between his two teammates, his eyes showing his obvious anger. What the hell? Naruto just chuckled nervously as he began to undo his headband as Shisui blinked in surprise, the conversation getting increasingly weird. Naruto handed him the band and Shisui looked at him oddly, however when his gaze traveled lower he looked down in amazement at the polished metal. Staring right back at him from his own reflection were a pair of two Tomo Sharingan, glowing slightly in the darkening light. Whoa, I have Sharingan. Naruto just smiled. Even Itachi managed to crack a small smile as he saw his cousin continue to look at his new eyes in amazement. Quickly though his head shot up and he lashed out at Naruto, the quick boy only just jumping back in time. Shisui watched again in amazement, marveling at how much slower Naruto seemed to travel. It was still much too fast for him to effectively counter, but it was still much better. His eyes gleamed slightly at the prospect of finally being able to fight with his teammates on equal terms. Congratulations. Shisui turned to Itachi, noting the small smile the normally more stoic Uchiha wore as he gently clasped his kin on the shoulder. Naruto did the same on his other shoulder, however a little more hesitantly after the boy's last outburst. You guys did this just so I could unlock my Sharingan. His teammates nodded and Shisui smiled before wincing as he felt his side burn suddenly, one of his ribs probably broken. Yeah, we figured it was about time you caught up. They all laughed and beamed to make their way back through the forest in the direction of the hotel. Shisui limped a little, but they made it in good time, quickly emerging from the tree line into the dwindling sunlight that still managed to barely reach over the horizon. So that was a genjutsu, it felt so real. Itachi just nodded. He was also feeling slightly winded from maintaining the powerful genjutsu over Naruto for so long. I can tell you more about it when I start training you in your Sharingan. Shisui looked around, slightly surprised at his friend for a moment before Itachi clarified. At least until you can have your own family train you. The other Uchiha nodded, wincing again as he held his side painfully. Did you have to go so hard, Naruto? The redhead merely chuckled as he slung an arm under his teammate's shoulder, supporting him as they made their way through the hotel. Itachi told me I had to make it as real as possible, so you really believed it was a life-threatening situation. Shisui just nodded with a sigh, but not before he sent a glare Itachi's way. With his Sharingan activated, it actually managed to look quite intimidating, not that it affected Itachi much. The rest of the way back to the room, Shisui played about with his new Jujutsu, practicing turning it on and off while smiling every time the world would slow around him slightly. Finally they made it back to the room where Ensui was lazily looking through a scroll. Their entrance made him look up and notice Shisui's eyes. "Oh, so it worked then, how bothersome." Shisui's eyes twitched violently as he sent an accusatory finger his sensei's way. "You knew too." Ensui just sighed as he nodded, returning to his scroll languidly. "Of course, I was the one who suggested it." Shisui's eye twitched again and he would have launched himself at his sensei if his side didn't suddenly flare out in pain. Ensui just looked up again with a sigh, the rings around his eyes making him look even more tired than his attitude would have you believe. The Jonin drawled, "So bothersome. Did you have to hurt him so badly? Now I'll have to get on my old, aching knees and heal him." Naruto just shrugged sheepishly before carefully setting his teammate down on a chair and flopping down on his own bed. Ensui quickly got up, his hand already lighting up in green chakra as he began to heal the worst of Shisui's injury. He wasn't an expert in medical ninjutsu, but as a Jonin he was forced to know enough to heal fairly minor injuries like this. Shisui watched the man go about his work, fascinated by the technique that was slowly resetting his ribs into their proper place. Unconsciously he activated his Sharingan and was amazed as he saw the chakra from the technique flow into his body. Intrinsically he began to understand how the whole process worked, how the medical chakra vibrated at just the right frequency to encourage his own body's healing. He smiled brightly as the pain was leached from his body. "So this is what I've been missing out on? Well, not anymore." The group picked up the pace next day, not wanting any other attacks like the one involving the Iwachinin. As they hopped through the trees, Itachi was explaining to Shisui about his Sharingan and the abilities he now had. While Shisui had, of course, pretty much had this conversation with his parents before, it took on a whole new meaning. Now, he actually had the bloodline. He continued to play with it, activating it on and off with a goofy grin while Itachi would just sigh at seeing the prestigious Jujutsu reduced to a novelty. Naruto listened in on their conversation, fascinated as he heard Itachi explain the intricacies of the Sharingan. He learned that the Uchiha have much better abilities concerning genjutsu due to their ability to see the chakra they use. Able to visually understand genjutsu made them intimate with the ability to manipulate their enemies' senses. He also found out about the slight predictive abilities the eyes held, although that mostly came into effect with the evolution to the 3-tomo state. However, Itachi hadn't activated that yet. He could only provide the explanation his own father had given him, verbatim. Nevertheless, Naruto was fascinated. He knew from his father that even a fully matured Sharingan was far from perfect. Minato was said to be one of the few people actually fast enough to render the predictive ability useless. While a well-trained Sharingan user could follow him with their eyes, their actual reflexes could do nothing to dodge or block him. It was one reason he had been well respected by the clan. Naruto thought to himself slightly smugly as he hopped from branch to branch. One day he would be that fast. When Itachi finally matured to 3-tomo, they would finally have the fight both had been waiting for. He was brought out of his daydream as his eyes widened, catching a slight flicker in the periphery of his vision. On reflex alone, he suddenly stopped on the branch he landed on, using his hands to suddenly swing around and press his back up against it. Moments after, 10 or so kunai impacted with the branch with dull thuds, some sailing over where his body would have been. Similar things happened with Itachi and Shisui, but with their respective Sharingan they were able to see it in time and hurl themselves out the way. Ensui merely melted away into his shadow, the kunai harmlessly passing overhead. Naruto sighed as he sprang back up onto his branch, already expecting it when a very large and muscular man dropped down some way out in front of the group. He wore black shinobi pants and sandals as well as an Iwa headband and flak jacket, but nothing else. His bulging, ripped upper body was clenching in intimidating display. He had many scars that dotted his chest and arms, a close-shaven sheer of brown hair, and black void-like eyes that stared at the 3 genin with dispassionate bloodlust. When I agreed to an assassination mission against that Gato guy, I thought it would be boring. His slightly scarred mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Then I see 2 Uchiha and I think my luck is turning around. Finally he looked at Naruto, his grin turning into a snarl, then I see the yellow flashes brat and that made me certain Kami was smiling on me. He chuckled darkly as he pulled out 2 kunai, letting the Konoha genin watch in amazement as he dug them into the earth. When he pulled them out, the 2 blades were coated with rock, forming 2 very long and sharp swords. Naruto glanced around, checking for their sensei, but he seemed to have conspicuously disappeared. He turned his attention back to their new opponent, noting the fact his flak jacket was that of a jonin. As powerful as the 3 were together, they didn't stand much of a chance against the man if he went full out. They simply had to hope he underestimated them. However, the bloodthirsty gleam in his eye said very differently. Meisi Kateke, the stone bull of Iwa. It was Shisui talking, and Naruto wasn't surprised considering his friend had practically memorized the bingo book as well as any notable ninja from other nations. Well, what do you know, my reputation precedes me. Naruto gulped when he noticed the slightly nervous look Shisui had. That could only mean the guy was powerful. Watch out for his swords, he can manipulate them into any weapon. Meisi just looked irritated as he glared at the Uchiha, pointing one of the stone blades his way. Don't ruin the surprise, it's rude, you should dash. He was cut off as Naruto suddenly rushed forward in a red blur, intent on catching the man at a moment of distraction. Unfortunately for him, the man is better than that, and even Naruto's impressive speeds were more average for a jonin of his caliber. He simply batted the redhead away with the flat of his sword, sending the genin into a tree. Immediately after that, he brought his 2 swords up, crossing them together as the stone merged into a large shield, blocking the massive fireball Shisui and Itachi had sent his way. He chuckled as the stone morphed back onto blades, this time slightly curved like scimitars. He used them to effortlessly parry the kick Naruto had sent him from behind, making the redhead's ankles throb in agony. The man wielding the weighty stone blades like they were paper toyed with the genin, nullifying and perfectly anticipating their weak attacks. Naruto tried not to show his frustration as he continued to launch lightning-fast strikes on the man, only to be parried by the flat of his blades every time. Seemingly without effort, the jonin began to exhaust them. It left Shisui and especially Itachi in slight awe of the jonin. Even he had trouble defending against Naruto when he was going all out like this. Suddenly the redhead backed off, flipping back to land on a tree where he quickly shrugged off arm and leg bands he had started wearing since the team had formed. He stretched out a moment, getting a feel for his muscles again after having them weighted down for a while. It was usually unwise for somebody to remove their weights in the middle of a fight, but Naruto always made sure he kept them off at the weekends so he could better acclimatize his body to the changes. Itachi and Shisui were left in even more amazement as Naruto seemingly disappeared from the branch. The only reason they were even still able to see him was their Sharingan. Even then he was still pretty much a blur. Both of them were thinking along similar lines as they saw him once again launch himself at the jonin he's been holding back this whole time. Naruto finally allowed himself to smirk. Meisi was still blocking every one of his attacks, but now he was visibly trying. He backed off again, panting slightly from the speed he had been moving at. Well, at least this confirms you really are that bastard's son. Only a namikaze could move that fast at your age. Naruto kept his emotions in check when the man insulted and praised his father in the same breath and simply turned his gaze to Shisui and Itachi. Getting the message, the 2 of them leapt at the man. Not being nearly as fast as Naruto, Meisi was easily able to fend off their attacks. However, when Naruto rejoined the fray, he suddenly found himself hard-pressed. Getting annoyed and bored, the Iwanin suddenly clasped his hands together, the 2 swords merging into one, much larger broadsword growing out like a jagged crystal. With a sweeping blow he managed to catch all 3 genin in a move even Itachi and Shisui's Sharingan couldn't help them against. All 3 suddenly found their necks enveloped in a stone collar attached to the kunai in the man's hands. When they tried to move, the collar would close slightly on their necks, suffocating them slowly. Impressive for genin, but in the end that's what you are, genin. He was suddenly cut off as dark black threads pierced his body in multiple places, including his heart. He could only blink once in surprise before the stone collars crumbled to dust and he fell off the branch, dead before he hit the ground. All 3 genin were left panting, rubbing their necks as their sensei suddenly revealed himself from the shadow of a nearby tree. You 3 did very well, especially against an opponent of Meisi's standards. Shisui just glared at their sensei, still rubbing his sore neck as he struggled to get air into his lungs again. Where were you, sensei? Ensui just sighed as he poked Meisi's dead body with his foot, this time actually checking to see if this was a clone or not. It was bothersome. So, I thought I would let you guys handle it. Turns out you needed my help in the end after all. Naruto and Itachi both frowned at this, suddenly feeling inadequate, which the lazy, but perceptive Nara making them out to be incapable. Don't feel bad though. Iwa's Stone Bull was an opponent even I would have had difficulty with if you three hadn't provided an adequate distraction. You performed admirably, and considering this man was an A-ranked Jonin, it was impressive you lasted as long as you did. The two still didn't look convinced, while Shisui still just seemed angry their sensei hadn't done anything until the last moment. Ensui just sighed as he began to move through the trees again, motioning for his team to do the same, murmuring under his breath about how bothersome it was to be a good teacher. Chapter 6, New Teachings. Both Naruto and Shisui had to repress their laughter as they stared down at the remarkably short businessman standing in front of them. He was completely consumed in his conversation with Ensui. When the man had first opened the door of his rather luxurious apartment, Naruto had thought it must have been somehow mechanically opened. It turned out Naruto was just looking straight over Gato's head. A fact that didn't seem to have passed by the tiny businessman. Since then the man seemed to harbor an unspoken grudge towards the two shinobi, minus Itachi, because he always seemed to disappear into the background whenever laughter emerged. But to add insult to injury, even Shisui, the shortest of them, managed to stand a good few inches above the man, despite being less than half his age. It was all they could do to stop snickering every time he would shoot them a glare. To quote Naruto, he said that if Anko were here she would be attempting to try that Western sport involving kicking a ball around. In honesty though, that was the highlight of the remaining mission, otherwise it was lackluster at best. It turned out that after they defeated Macy, the harassment attempts and hits on Gato's head just stopped all of a sudden. It swelled Shisui's ego for a while, thinking that the assassins feared their team. At least it did, until Itachi reminded him that they could merely be waiting for them to leave so they would have better chances. No matter what the reason, the results were the same. The three of them became quickly bored. At least Naruto got off slightly easy. He had his scroll with him to jot down notes that struck him. Even so, they still managed to squeeze in as much training as they could, using the opportunities when they weren't guarding Gato. Itachi was seriously impressed by the rate Shisui managed to pick up on the Sharingan techniques he began showing him. He had even remarked one day that because the way their fights were slowly turning, it was like he had already unlocked the Jujutsu's predictive abilities. Naruto hadn't had a chance to spar with Shisui yet, but when he did he would be sure to remind the Uchiha that he wasn't suddenly invincible. Quickly though, the time they were assigned to the mission came and went, and before they knew it they were back on the road. Naruto had the pleasure of turning one last time to catch one of Gato's disdainful looks before returning his attention to the path ahead. I really hated that guy. He didn't need to turn to see the enthusiastic nod he got from Shisui or the slight smirk from Itachi. You shouldn't say those kinds of things about the client, it's far too bothersome to deal with the aftermath. Naruto just huffed, blowing air out between his teeth in irritation. It passed quickly. He's not the client anymore. Ensui just shrugged lazily before he suddenly jumped into the trees above them, the genin quickly following. That's not to say he couldn't be in the future. Naruto just huffed again, unable to deny the man's lazy logic yet still annoyed by it all the same. He checked around them as they sprinted through the tree branches, looking for any sign of an ambush like the one at the start of their mission. In honesty, he kind of missed it. That had been the first real opportunity they had to prove themselves, and he wanted to feel that rush again. He noticed Shisui running next to him, Sharingan active as it had been ever since he had acquired them. At first Itachi had warned him that it would simply waste his chakra. However, after Naruto had pointed out that it could almost work like a passive chakra control exercise, he too had taken to keeping his Jujutsu frequently active. That wasn't to say it was indefinite. Even for an Uchiha, their eyes were taxing on their chakra systems. Even so, the Uchiha prodigy had definitely noticed a slight rise in both his already considerable control and hardy fortitude. It was another reason Naruto was anxious to get back to Konoha. He didn't like his teammates suddenly having this edge over him. He needed to get back and start training seriously again, his speed and chakra control among the priorities. He smirked as he sprinted. He knew exactly the jutsu that could help him with that, as well as kill two birds with one stone. He had been putting off going through his father's things for long enough. Well, that was boring as hell. All he got were 2 nods of agreement from his teammates, surprising him as he saw Itachi actually agreeing that something was boring. Yeah, I wonder if all mission reports are like that. Naruto just shrugged. Honestly, he wasn't sure what he had been expecting. A smirk suddenly crossed his face. Then again, it might have been worth it to see the look on the old man's face when Ensui-sensei told him we faced Iwa's stone bull. Shisui laughed at that and even Itachi smirked. Sarutobi had almost lost his pipe when he heard that and was unable to stop staring at the 3 genin in surprise for the rest of the meeting. Must you call Hokage-sama something so disrespectful? I would have thought your own father having been Hokage would make you more inclined to respect the position. Naruto just chuckled as they walked down the streets, enjoying being back after a few weeks. I have the highest respects for the position, but for me respect in a person is earned, not given. Itachi raised an eyebrow at this but didn't break stride as they continued to move towards the Uchiha compound and by slight extension the Namikaze household. And his defending the village through the Second and Third Shinobi Wars, as well as his aid in defeating the Kyuubi on top of his years of service to the village are not grounds for respect. Naruto just gave Itachi a blank look before looking ahead and walking a little faster. Itachi glanced at Shisui but his fellow Uchiha just shrugged, not knowing what had Naruto so touchy all of a sudden. Naruto, the leaf is our home and Hokage-sama is our leader. Naruto turned on Shisui swiftly, an anger and betrayal in his eyes that they had never seen in him before. And where was he when my parents died? Where was he when I went home to an empty house where I knew I would never see them again? Shisui could only blink in surprise as he took a step back, not expecting the outburst. A few civilians even stopped to look at them. Itachi went to put a hand on his friend's shoulder but the redhead shrugged off the contact. 6 months. It took him 6 months after their funeral for him to visit me. I know he's busy, but 6 months. Itachi just looked lost, unable to speak because he didn't know what to say. Naruto just breathed heavily for a few moments before turning on a heel and sprinting away, leaving the 2 Uchiha speechless in the middle of the street. He raced back through the village, moving towards the one place where he could think clearly, where his mind didn't become one big angry blur. He vaulted the walls of his home in one bound, dashing around the side of the house until he was able to stop and stand still out in the training ground. He looked down at the reflection of himself in the small pond, watching as the wind gently disturbed the image that stared back at him. He collapsed to his knees, eyes still locked on the water until a single drop disturbed the pond, rippling the image until he couldn't see himself anymore. He wiped away the other tear that was just about to fall, stifling a sob as he angrily punched the water, turning away from it harshly to lie back on the grass, just staring up at the sky, lost in his thoughts. Time moved on and Naruto apologized to his friends. He knew he shouldn't have lashed out like that but he was bottling up his emotions unhealthily. They of course forgave him, after very little thought, but to say their eyes hadn't been opened slightly would have been an injustice. To Shisui, Naruto had always been a pillar of strength. Before he came along he was always known as the other Uchiha, the one that wasn't Itachi. Of course he held no resentment towards his cousin but it was lonely when everybody else only paid attention to the prodigy. To see Naruto, somebody who worked hard for what he wanted and achieved it, without any kind of Kekai Genkai or Jujutsu, it made him hope. He was the calm one, the one who kept his head but still found the time to have fun and enjoy life. To see him lose it like that, it cracked the image the aspiring Uchiha had of his friend. In the same way thought helped their friendship, when Shisui stopped seeing Naruto as some kind of goal to strive for and instead saw a person with emotions and limits. He found it easier to smile and speak softly with Naruto, after those thoughts. For Itachi, his body clenched painfully in silence, while both he and Naruto would call each other friends, he knew it was a loose term at best. They were sparring partners, rivals, people who used each other to improve themselves. He never went over to talk, never saw a purpose to that. He never specifically considered Naruto for something other than a mechanism for training. In a way, Itachi envied his cousin. Shisui and Naruto were friends, that much anybody could admit. When he witnessed how wrenched Naruto felt about feeling abandoned by the third, and perhaps by his parents, he realized that something would need to change. Over time after that incident the three only managed to grow closer. Itachi began to try more, acting like a friend instead of an acquaintance. Shisui and Naruto were already close, frequently spending time together. But afterward, each practically lived in the other's house. There would always be a place set for Naruto in Shisui's home and a bed ready for Shisui in Naruto's. They continued to do missions, always excelling and getting noted for their impeccable teamwork and innovation in tight situations. In the 6 months after that, both Shisui and Itachi managed to reach the final stage of their Sharingan, the youngest in recorded Uchiha history since Madara Uchiha. Anko, well, she was Anko. If there was something in Naruto's life he could count on to always be there and never change, it was her. She was like an immovable rock. When she had heard about the way he had erupted at his friends, she had forced him to go straight over and apologize, after squeezing him to death for about 5 minutes, of course. It had led to an amusing conversation regarding who exactly was the guardian in their relationship. Needless to say, it didn't end well for Naruto and he ended up in the Uchiha district with an aching side. It turned out that during his absence on the mission, Anko had practically thrown herself into her studies and training, easily becoming the top shinobi in her class. Naruto couldn't wipe the grin off his face when he heard that, but there was a lot of teasing about her having nothing else to do without him around. It was amusing because of the shade of red her face had turned when she couldn't think of a suitable comeback or answer. 6 months later and nothing had changed. Anko was still flying through the academy with distinction, although she did have Naruto helping her whenever he could between missions. It turned out that after their first successful B-ranked mission, it had opened the floodgates. After a while they even began to be specifically requested by clients, although some were skeptical when they actually showed up due to their age. The team wasn't complaining though. The missions paid well and usually the most they had to deal with was the occasional errant A-rank missing nin. In essence, life was good. Everybody in their close-knit group was never bored, never abandoned to themselves. Naruto and Anko's frenetic antics were enough to keep Shisui entertained while Itachi found pleasure in training and carrying out his missions. Sometimes Naruto believed he believed too heavily in the ideals of the village and not enough in his own, but he couldn't really do much about it. Despite not being open with it, Itachi could almost prove to be as stubborn as an Uzumaki. Whether you could take that as a compliment or not was debatable, however. Finally, time had passed quickly enough that Naruto found himself lazily, yet nervously sitting on the couch in his home. He was trying to flick through a scroll of intermediate ceiling, but his mind really wasn't focused on the paper in his hands. Instead his gaze kept flickering between it and the door, anxiously awaiting Anko to walk through. She had passed her genin exam a few days ago, the only one in her class to do so even though others had tried. That worried Naruto, thinking she might be placed with an older group of genin who would no doubt belittle or underappreciate her because of her age. Right now she was in the academy with the rest of the genin who had passed this year, all likely waiting for their Jonin sensei to arrive, or already having met them. He desperately wanted to know who she got. It would more than likely define the kunoichi she became in the future, even with his own influence in her training. They say there was always at least one student who took after their sensei. In their group at least it was Shisui. Just as he was about to get up and move outside to train and calm his nerves, he heard the front door open. He swiveled on a dime and immediately walked over to the hall where he watched a grinning Anko practically bounce through the door. The sight brought a smile to his face. The Jonin instructor must have been a good one for her to be so happy. So I take it by your smile it went well. Anko just beamed as she skipped towards him, actually skipped. It was enough to make him double take. Anko wasn't particularly girlish, so to see her acting this way was weird to say the least. Better than well, awesome. The redhead just raised an eyebrow, chuckling as he followed the euphoric girl back through the house to where she simply flopped down on the couch with a satisfied smile. So who did you get? Anko's happy smile quickly morphed into a very mischievous and somewhat smug grin as she turned and stared him right in the eyes. Oh, nobody. She turned disinterestedly and began to pick at her fingernails with a kunai, a habit Naruto had no idea how she picked up because it wasn't from him, just, Orochimaru of the Sunin. She said it with such nonchalance that it actually took a moment for Naruto to register what she had said. Orochimaru? As in the teammate of Jiraiya, the guy who trained my father. Anko just nodded happily, yet again with that same slightly smug look on her features. The one and only, and not only that but he took me on as an apprentice. Naruto blinked in surprise. He wasn't doubting Anko's abilities, of course, or Orochimaru's judgment. In fact, Anko was an astounding kunoichi already. There was the fact that it was almost unheard of for somebody to take such a young apprentice. At that age it was usually difficult to predict the kind of ninja the student would become. Even so, that didn't stop the smile that spread across Naruto's face as he pulled Anko into a somewhat unexpected hug. Congratulations. Anko was shocked for only a brief moment before she accepted the hug, smiling happily into Naruto's shoulder until he broke away. Thanks, I already know it's gonna be awesome. He's going to teach me so many cool jutsu, maybe I'll even get a summoning contract. Naruto grinned again. Getting a contract was one of the greatest honors bestowed on a shinobi, usually passed down from parent to child or sensei to student. His own father had inherited the toad contract from Jiraiya, as Anko would no doubt receive the snake contract from Orochimaru. Well, I think we should celebrate. Anko initially looked happy at that thought, but her face suddenly took on a slightly green tinge as she remembered the last time the two had celebrated. She now knew that alcohol, no matter how delicious, would have to wait until she was older, and it wouldn't incapacitate her for an entire day. Alright, how about visiting that new restaurant that opened up, the Dango place? Naruto just nodded happily, already getting up and pulling on his tracksuit top. Today was Anko's day and they would do whatever she wanted to do. As they left, Anko was wondering how Dango tasted, never having had the pleasure of tasting the sweet dumplings, ironic considering her namesake. She just shrugged, she would find out soon anyway. Naruto just watched on in a subtle mix between horror, fascination, and jealousy. It turned out that Anko liked Dango. By liked, Naruto meant that Anko had taken to the sweet delicious dumplings like fish do to water or birds to air or he did to ramen. It was both disgusting and hypnotizing to watch her shovel down the food, sliding the treats off the skewers sometimes in one bite. It was just something to try and imagine where she was putting it all. As far as he could tell, she didn't even appear to be slowing down after the fifth plate. He had to admit the dumplings were pretty delicious, not as much so as ramen, but they would probably constitute his favorite dessert from now on. However, when he reached for his own, Anko would merely slap his hands away before picking up the skewer, despite having more in her own hands. In the end, just to get any food at all, he had to resort to using his speed to quickly steal the dango from the ravenous girl as quickly as possible. Finally, although it seemed like it would never end, Anko sat lazily back in her chair with contented, lidded eyes as she gently swayed and allowed her delicious meal to settle. His smile matched her body language, relaxed and content. It at least let Naruto know what to get Anko if she was ever in a mood again. The sweet dumplings were better than drugs. Suddenly the girl shot forward in her chair, sitting bolt upright as her eyes became fixed on something at the door to the small dango bar. Naruto turned only to see a tall man with long black hair wearing the standard Jonin garb, the navy jumpsuit with the olive flak jacket. He walked confidently and seemed to hold an aura of power about himself while his yellow eyes showed experience and intelligence. Of course, Naruto immediately knew who it was. His team's fight with Hanzo of the Salamanders was legendary after all. Orochimaru-sensei. Well, at least that confirmed it. The older man took note of the excitable purple-haired girl waving to him and smiled warmly. His smirk held a little bit of a calculative edge, but otherwise he appeared friendly and kind, if a bit distant and aloof. Anko-chan, surprised seeing you here, so soon after we meet nonetheless. Anko just grinned happily as she motioned between Naruto and her new sensei. Naruto, this is Orochimaru-sensei, and she would have continued if Orochimaru hadn't placed a hand on her shoulder. No need, child, I know of Namikaze-kun already. How could I not know of our dear, departed Hokage's son? Naruto blinked a moment, confused when he thought he heard a hint of bitterness when the man mentioned his father, but quickly shrugged it off as his ears playing tricks. He held out a hand which Orochimaru took, only a slight hint of hesitance to substantiate Naruto's previous confusion. Nice to meet you, Sunin-san. Orochimaru just smiled, the edges of his lips turning up. So formal, like your father. This time there was nothing. The snake-like man kept his voice perfectly level, although his handshake was rather tight. Anko didn't seem to notice the tension between the two, only happy that her best friend and soon-to-be mentor were getting along. We need more dango. Naruto groaned while Orochimaru just seemed amused. He had certainly chosen an interesting apprentice. Anko was outside working on a jutsu her sensei had instructed her to learn, except the only problem was she was finding it incredibly difficult. Surprisingly, Naruto was no help. the redhead had been very mysterious over the last few days. Whenever she would ask him to train, he would simply reply he was busy before returning to his father's study. She had tried to get in and see what it was he was so enraptured with, but it was nearly impossible to sneak up on the boy, at least for her. She focused on her technique again, molding the chakra Orochimaru had said was required as she tried to unconsciously tap into the summoning contract. Slowly she went through the hand seals. Her sensei had told her that if she kept at it she would do it without them, but for now this would do. She built up the chakra before sticking out both her arms, letting her new long-sleeve shirt hang loosely from her wrists. Hidden shadow snake hands. She gritted her teeth before miraculously a single long green snake slithered from her wrist, building its body from the chakra she provided. She sighed when it dispelled. She was still unable to maintain the chakra required to use it effectively, but at least it was a start. She nearly flopped to the floor out of exhaustion but caught herself on a training post, managing to move her body back towards the house to see if Naruto wanted anything to eat. However, as soon as she crossed the threshold of the house she heard what sounded like a slight buzzing come from upstairs like swirling wind. Yes. Anko just raised an eyebrow as she turned her head upwards towards where she heard the cry. With a tired sigh she half-dragged herself up the stairs and walked over to the old Hokage's study. Tentatively she pushed open the door, surprised when it actually opened. Naruto had usually kept it locked when he was working on his secret project. Oddly, the room was empty save for a scroll on the desk with complex notes and diagrams, as well as what appeared to be balloons and rubber balls dotted around the room, all burst. Suddenly she heard that same strange sound and made her way over to the window to look out over the training field out back. Naruto was outside, the redhead apparently staring at his right hand in intense concentration. To the young girl's amazement, chakra began to swirl hypnotically around his palm, seemingly drawn out of the air itself. Finally, it coalesced into a perfect sphere, just larger than Naruto's hand, which pulsed almost excitedly with blue swirling energy. If Anko had been amazed by that simple display, what came next practically had her on the floor out of shock. Naruto charged at a nearby tree, slamming the ball of what seemed like pure unbridled energy into the trunk. Instead of stopping or fading away, the sphere just kept going, shearing through the tree like it was butter. Finally Naruto pushed it all the way through, watching with a satisfied smile as the large tree simply toppled over, its support now weakened. He spotted the purple blur out of the corner of his eye, sidestepping as she raced past. She was suddenly full of energy. She excitedly looked at the remains of the tree, now just a haphazard stump in the ground, before turning back to Naruto with a look of pure amazement. What was that? Naruto just smiled sheepishly as he rubbed the back of his head, noting the slight tingle in his right hand that let him know the technique wasn't quite perfect yet. That was what I've been working on recently. When it looked like Anko wasn't going to be satisfied with that answer, he sighed and continued, "It's a jutsu my father created as a complement to his fighting style, basically just high-tier chakra control." Anko just blinked at the very humble way Naruto described the incredible technique he had just displayed. After seeing what it did to a fully grown tree, she could only imagine what kind of damage it could do to an opponent. Chakra control. Naruto just nodded as he held out his right hand, palm upwards, just slightly cupping his fingers. Quicker than before the Rasengan formed, once again pulsing brilliantly with blue light as the energies contained within Naruto's palm tried to break free of their spherical prison. It's pure shape manipulation. According to the scrolls, he based it off of some kind of attack used by Biju, scaled down of course. He suddenly looked down, slightly sadly, as Anko noticed, staring wistfully at the large ball of chakra. "It's unfinished though." Anko raised an eyebrow while simultaneously scoffing. From what she had seen, that attack was anything but unfinished. She couldn't imagine what the proper version would look like or even do. In the scrolls it said he always wanted to add his elemental affinity into it, but between the war and becoming Hokage he never found the chance. He sighed again before a small smile worked its way onto his now rather apparently tired features. "But that's why I'm going to do it for him. I'll add my elemental affinity and make him proud." Anko smiled at that, unable to avoid being caught up in his infectious confidence that spilled out like waves. "So what's it called?" Naruto grinned as he slammed the sphere of energy through another tree. "Rasengan." Anko just stared at the newly disfigured tree for a moment with what can only be described as awe before grinning right back. "Oh, you are so teaching me that." The next month passed in a blur of training for everybody. Aside from missions, the two Uchiha stayed in their compound a lot, apparently both being trained in the Sharingan. Apparently it was some kind of tradition for when an Uchiha reached the three-tomo state, however it had never happened at such a young age. Naruto missed Shisui's company, but he had plenty to keep himself occupied in the meantime, and he knew they would all come back stronger for it. He continued to work on the Rasengan, experimenting with making it bigger or more concentrated. He knew elemental manipulation was a bit out of his league at the moment, only recently getting to grips with his wind affinity to even begin to attempt it. Instead he trained his speed as usual, as well as trying to teach Anko the Rasengan. Strangely, the girl didn't seem to take to it, apparently finding the concept of molding her chakra into something visible hard to wrap her head around. When Naruto had asked the Hokage about this during one of his infrequent visits, he had simply replied it had been the same when Minato had tried to teach his own students. Apparently, the technique in itself wasn't all that difficult to achieve, it was just so alien an idea to most that they couldn't wrap their heads around it. Even Sarutobi had to admit that Minato's self-created jutsu was far beyond even him. He was too set in his old, structured ways. However, it appeared that one of his father's students had managed to create their own jutsu based off his father's, apparently making it quite famous, the Reikari. That wasn't to say Anko had nothing to keep her occupied. Orochimaru turned out to be quite the intensive sensei. As soon as she would master a technique he would give her, it would be straight on to the next one. He also proved to be very attentive, always willing to help out Anko as long as it was only to adjust what she was doing. Apparently he praised natural talent, enjoying those that could take a concept and flesh it out on their own without assistance. To be fair, it showed commitment, ingenuity, and creativity, all good qualities in a shinobi. Naruto often watched the two of them during his own training, at least when Orochimaru actually supervised Anko's training in the Namikaze training ground. When the man had first seen Naruto use the Rasengan, obliterating a training dummy in the process, he had first been stunned. He had quickly recovered, congratulating the redhead on mastering such a difficult jutsu that he, begrudgingly, admitted he could not recreate. Naruto found the man's company to be pleasant. He was incredibly interesting to listen to, and he had many stories from his time as part of the Sunin, at least when they were a team. While he sometimes came off as slightly arrogant, when his reputation was brought into question it was actually understandable. He had once jokingly suggested a spar between the two of them. Needless to say, he dominated the fight from start to finish. At least Naruto learned that day that Orochimaru wasn't the kind to pull a punch, or in his case, a snake. The man was like wind when Naruto wanted to hit him, and, despite all the advancements he had made in the area, his speed was nothing compared to the Sunin. His body still burned a little from the toxins the man kept pumping him with various snake bites. All his attacks would come out of nowhere, all in unconventional means like through the ground or once even out of a tree. In all, Naruto could plainly see that he was outclassed hopelessly, and, without somehow injecting years of training in the forthcoming months, that wasn't going to change anytime soon. Anko also showed marked improvement under his tutelage, mastering jutsu after jutsu, including some unique to the Sunin himself. He had allowed her to sign the snake summoning contract, which had involved a frightful experience with Manda, the boss summon, that would be ingrained into Naruto's memory for quite some time. The two of them would be starting missions soon, which lowered Naruto's spirits slightly, knowing that they would only see less of one another in the next few years. Still, it only meant that he had to make the time he had no count all the more. Chapter 7, New Challenges. Chunin Exams. Naruto looked down at the consent form in his hands, his eyebrow quirked up high as his gaze flickered between it and his sensei. That's right, it's bothersome, but if you agree I can sign you up for the upcoming Chunin exams. Naruto just continued to look incredulous, a sentiment mirrored by his teammates. What gives? I thought you said that we were bound to get a field promotion to Chunin soon anyway. Ensui just shrugged lazily, already looking like he just wanted to leave and laze under the clouds. Hokage-sama believed it would be a good idea to enter U3 anyway. The Chunin exams are supposed to show the power behind a certain village. What better way to express that than having our youngest and most accomplished genin participate? More so if you win. Shisui just snorted as he put the form in his pocket. You mean when we win? Itachi smirked at that. Shisui had every reason to be cocky. 3 years into their genin careers and the team had already completed more B-ranked missions than many chunin. Ensui just sighed, already starting to walk away from the group towards the Nara clan compound. In any case, if you want to enter, just sign the consent forms and be at the academy at 10 tomorrow. With that the lazy Jonin walked off, leaving the 3 genin alone to ponder his offer. So what do you guys think? It was Naruto who asked. In the last 2 years he had grown considerably, now standing a respectable 4 foot 10 inches for a 9-year-old. His long, spiky red hair hung around his head in what most described as a mop, covering his eyes to a degree due to his forehead protector being around his bicep. He continued to wear his father's old tracksuit jacket, only now he kept it open, revealing the fishnet shirt underneath. He also wore baggy black pants tucked into his dark boot-like sandals. He wasn't the only one to have grown. Itachi now stood level with him, unlike Shisui who was just slightly shorter. He now let his long dark hair cinch into a small ponytail with 2 straight bangs framing each side of his face. A high-collared black shirt of the Uchiha clutched his narrow frame, gray 3/4 length pants and black sandals completing the attire. Nowadays, it was a rare sight to see the stoic Uchiha without his Sharingan activated, having garnered the ability to keep it visible all day. He had also taken to keeping a tanto slung over his shoulder, managing to cast an intimidating sight for one so young. Shisui was probably the one who had changed the least. While he too kept his Sharingan activated most of the time, he lacked the serious edge to his features that Itachi managed, face smooth where Itachi bore slight wrinkles. He wore a high-collared light gray vest open at the front to reveal his dark gray shirt and tan belt. Below that, he wore standard navy shinobi pants tied around his shins with tape and dark gray standard sandals. However, beneath his unassuming appearance he was an opponent to be reckoned with, sometimes surprising his teammates with his ingenuity to win a fight. Basic analysis of their team's composition would reveal that Naruto was the speedy powerhouse of the group, Itachi the calculating tactician and swift support, while Shisui was the wild card, rapidly adapting and redefining his role. It was true the aspiring Uchiha had dabbled in nearly every area of ninja studies and found something he liked from each. His taijutsu was something even Naruto found hard to counter, and his genjutsu, while not the match of Itachi, still gave him an edge in a fight, and his ninjutsu were always so unpredictable it was like trying to fight multiple opponents. I think we're going to kick some genin ass. Both of Shisui's teammates smirked at that before each disappeared to go home. Shisui vanished in a flicker of motion, Itachi dissolved into crows, and Naruto just disappeared. Anko was out training. At least, if sparring with Orochimaru could count as training. It involved her pulling out every trick in her arsenal just to not get thrown around the training ground, more a game of survival than true practice. Currently, both of them had snakes protruding out of their sleeves, the scaly creatures fighting for dominance, a fight Orochimaru was winning. Suddenly, Anko was caught unawares as Orochimaru's tongue suddenly shot out of his mouth, wrapping around her neck in one motion and throwing her harshly across the field. She landed ready to keep fighting, but her sensei just chuckled. "That's enough for today, Anko-chan. You've been training hard recently and you should take a break." Anko just nodded with a smile, desperately trying not to show just how exhausted she was from their long fight. She failed miserably, sweat was soaking her forehead and clothes as she was panting for breath. Quickly she walked back inside the house through the sliding door and nearly collapsed on a chair in the kitchen. She didn't, because at that moment Naruto seemingly appeared in the room, still looking down at the consent form. Like Shisui, Anko hadn't changed all that much. She was taller than 2 years ago, standing a little under Shisui in height. She still wore that same style of clothing, just a plain dark navy t-shirt, as well as beige shorts that went down to her mid-thigh. However, she'd also grown attached to wearing long fishnet stockings above her blue sandals and proudly displaying a snake-tooth necklace her sensei had given her as a present. "Hey Fishcake, what's that?" Naruto looked up in surprise, not expecting anybody to be in the kitchen when he had shunshined in, appearing in a red blur. "Oh, this? It's a consent form for the Chunin exams." Her interest suddenly piqued. Anko moved around, peering over the redhead's shoulder at the slip of paper. "Chunin exams." Naruto just nodded lamely as he put the form down on the counter. "Yeah, Ensui-sensei asked us to enter. Something about showing off our village's strength through us." Anko just huffed as she crossed her arms over her chest in annoyance. Lucky you. Orochimaru-sensei won't let me enter the exams until next year. Naruto looked up, ignoring the form for the moment as Anko sat in his lap on the chair. It was something she had used to do to get a rise out of him, nowadays she just did it naturally because they were both used to it. Why not? Anko just shrugged as she leaned back on his chest, stretching slightly to alleviate some aches that had worked their way into her muscles during training. Hell if I know. Sensei can be pretty mysterious sometimes. He says I can enter after some kind of training trip he has planned for me. Naruto also leaned back in the chair, adjusting as Anko got comfortable, which meant grinding into his lap without meaning to. Training trip. Anko finally perked up as she nodded enthusiastically, turning with a smile on her face. Yeah. He's going to take me all over the elemental nations for half a year so I can learn all kinds of new things. Naruto just smiled as well, wrapping his arms around his friend in a light hug which she would have returned if she wasn't facing the wrong way. Congratulations, that's great. When do you go? Anko's smile flipped to a frown as she entered what Naruto had dubbed her cute concentration pose, with her tongue sticking out the corner of her mouth. I guess not too long after the Chunin exams, maybe a week or two. Naruto ensnared her into a tight embrace her again before gently sliding the girl off his lap so he could stand up. Cool. Well, make sure you come back stronger and maybe you'll actually land a hit on me in our spars. Anko growled playfully as she swung at him, only for the redhead to duck far below the punch and disappear in a flash of red. Nice try, Anko. Better luck next time. Anko's lips thinned, drooping into a grimace, before Orochimaru called out to her and she raced back outside. Before she did though, she took another look at the slip of paper on the counter and sighed. Things are moving so fast, don't worry Naruto. I'll catch up to you any way I can. So why do you think we have to go to the academy? As always it was Shisui who tried to strike up conversation in their small group as the three genin made their way towards the Shinobi Academy. Maybe there is a written test. Itachi, always the voice of reason amongst the group, wasn't all too concerned if that was the case. Nah, what the hell does a written test have to do with being a Chunin? Naruto on the other hand was slightly more dismissive of the whole thing, acting far more relaxed than he normally was. However, to the two Uchiha's trained eyes they noticed it was slightly strained, which was unusual for the normally overly calm Naruto. Itachi just sighed, knowing why he was acting this way. In Naruto's mind this was next major stepping stone in his ninja life. This would make him one step closer to overcoming his father like he had promised. He was most likely quite nervous. I would not be so quick to dismiss a written test or anything that happens in these exams. Have you forgotten what Ensui-sensei told us? Naruto sighed low in annoyance as he increased the pace, obviously rather anxious just to get to the academy, his steps wider and his gait uneven. Yeah. Look beneath the underneath, my dad had the same mantra. Itachi just nodded curtly, satisfied his teammate would at least treat the exams seriously, no matter what they were. You don't think it's like practice for when we have to do mission reports, do you? Both Naruto and Itachi stopped, staring at their teammate incredulously before blinking and carrying on. Kami, I hope not. For some reason just the thought of paperwork sent a small shiver up all three of their spines. Finally they reached the academy, walking up the stairs to the third floor, not even bothering to glance at a rather poor genjutsu cast over a second floor sign. Finally they stopped in front of classroom 303, not even fazed when Ensui melted out of a nearby shadow. You actually decided to come? And here I thought I was going to have a botherless week. None of them even looked at the man, already far too used to his attitude to care anymore. Well, at least you three came together, not that I really thought one wouldn't. Shisui raised an eyebrow at this, looking at their sensei strangely. And what would have happened if one of us decided not to take part? Ensui just smiled lazily, reminding Naruto of a silver-haired umbu he had seen once when the man was supporting them on a mission and had taken off his dog mask. Then the other two wouldn't have been allowed to participate. The Chunin exams are a team event. How else are you supposed to show teamwork and leadership? The three genin could only nod at the logic before Ensui patted them each on the back. Now get in there, I want you all to become Chunin. Even Itachi couldn't help the smile that managed to find its way onto his face. Being your sensei is far too bothersome, only to be immediately replaced by a frown. They scowled at their sensei, who just uncharacteristically chuckled and melted back into the shadows. They walked into the class, ignoring most of the other genin assembled as they all stared at the newcomers. Many just seemed to be surprised by their ages, definitely being the youngest group there by a good few years. Others seemed to think it was some kind of joke, and Naruto even heard one boy whispering that it might be part of the exams. When he told his teammates, they just laughed. Soon enough they would be able to show they belonged here. They weren't waiting long in their seats before the door opened for the last time, admitting one very tired-looking Jonin. He slowly walked to the front of the large classroom with his fingers rubbing the bridge of his nose, making it look like he had a nasty headache. He was a lanky man wearing the standard Jonin attire of the jumpsuit and flak jacket with long unruly brown hair and a long katana strapped to his back. Naruto leaned over in his seat to Shisui as they watched the man tiredly lean back against the front wall of the room. Could have made a better entrance, maybe some smoke bombs or something. Shisui chuckled with a shrug as they turned their attention to the man at the front of the room. "All right, I'm Mishoto Jekia, the first proctor of the Chunin exams." He looked towards the door of the room in annoyance, like he was trying to set it on fire with his mind before he resumed rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I'm only here because my old teammate called in a favor, so let's just get this over with." Naruto raised an eyebrow as he leaned back in his chair, once again leaning over to Shisui. Just the picture of enthusiasm in this one. Shisui chuckled again as Mishoto pulled out a clipboard seemingly from nowhere and began to look down the names. "All right, I'm going to call you up individually and you'll go through that door." He motioned with his thumb to an unassuming door behind him, where you'll receive the first test. "Any questions?" A few people raised their hands. No? Good. A few people scowled and started calling out, but the man just stared up with bloodshot eyes in a scowl that made everybody silent again. "Like I said. Now, first up is Tekyo Akazumi from Takigakure." A tall boy with jet black hair stood up and walked towards the door, disappearing behind it and never coming back out. It continued in this manner for a while as prospective Chunin were called up to enter the room, none of them ever coming out again. Naruto just assumed it was because there was a door on the other side from whatever the test was and they didn't want people knowing what the test was. Quickly Naruto figured out it was supposed to simulate a situation where you were going into a mission blind, with little knowledge of what you would face. Soon enough the ends were called up. Naruto had to go down and he got a good luck from Shisui and a nod from Itachi. Quickly, in case he earned a scowl from their frightening proctor, he made his way to the door and slipping through. He turned from closing the door only to raise an eyebrow when he realized where he was. He didn't remember using the room all that often during his brief span in the academy, but he was certain he was in one of the many dojos that littered the school. It was a very large room, probably stretching all 3 floors of the building. He jumped as a hand rested on his shoulder only to calm when he realized it was another Jonin. He pointed to the middle of the room where a massive pole was firmly planted on the floor, stretching up all 3 floors. "This is your first test. You have 5 minutes to get the bell that's resting in a recess atop that pole." Naruto was about to ask him a question, but the man just raised a finger to his lips. He didn't say anything, but the message was clear. Naruto would be receiving no help in this test. He dropped down to the floor of the dojo, looking up at the impressive height of the pole. Knowing it would be useless but deciding to try anyway, he forced chakra into his legs and jumped as high as he could. Like he had thought, he only reached about 3/4 of the way up before gravity took hold again. He looked up again, knowing he didn't have much time to think too hard on this. Carefully, he placed a foot on the pole, attempting to latch onto it with chakra. Immediately his foot just slid off like he didn't use chakra at all. Naruto's lips quirked into a knowing grin. They had obviously treated the pole the same way they had the walls of Konoha, so ninja couldn't climb it. Instead, he ran at the walls of the room, thankful when his feet did manage to stick and he was able to sprint up the side of the room. He reached the top and was about to place his foot on the ceiling when he paused. He repeated the action, but more slowly, noting that he once again couldn't gain purchase to simply walk over and drop down on the bell. He could see it glinting in the small recess atop the pole like it was taunting him, and he was so close. He quickly took out a kunai, aiming carefully before launching it at the bell in hopes he could push it out onto the floor. His hopeful look turned into dismay as a small bubble of blue light sprung up around the top of the pole, deflecting his kunai harmlessly. Damn it, I hate barriers, looks like it's only supposed to repel weapons though. He sighed in annoyance but quickly pulled out a small slip of paper usually reserved for explosive notes. He hastily began to scribble out a rough seal across it, too pressed for time to make it perfect. He could only hope it would do as he wrapped the small note around his kunai, knowing he couldn't have more than 30 seconds left. He threw his weapon again and the barrier sprung up in response. However, this time the kunai glowed slightly as it passed through the bubble of light, hitting the bell and managing to knock it out of the dimple. He caught it before it hit the ground, ducking into a small roll as he hit the ground before handing the bell to the Junin. He just nodded, making a note of his name before telling him to leave through a door lower down in the room. As he left, he could only wonder how his teammates would do. They didn't have his sealing knowledge. Itachi would most likely use his crow to simply get the bell, which made Naruto jealous of his ease for a moment. Shisui would probably just get up the wall like him and shunshin to the bell, though most people would find such a move impossible. The idea of the shunshin was to temporarily revitalize your entire body with energy, giving you a burst of speed. However, the problem with that was it was very difficult to adjust how much energy you put into it. For most it was a long-range transport jutsu with little fighting application due to its unpredictability. However, it became apparent when Shisui had learned the move that he had an almost unnatural control over the technique, able to finally focus just where he ended up. He was even able to use it in a fight, almost looking like he was using the Hiraishin as he jumped about the fight. Unfortunately for him, the technique was rather taxing. So far he could use it up to 5 times in quick succession. Either way, he would have faith that his teammates would be able to do it. He had to. Alright brats, welcome to Training Ground 18, or as the Umbu like to call it, the City of Bones. The tall Jonin Proctor standing in front of the gates to the training ground grinned at the slightly nervous faces of a few of the genin. Others seemed less concerned and he couldn't fault them. On the outside the training ground didn't really seem like much. However, there was a reason it was a training ground even Umbu didn't particularly enjoy being in. Behind this fence is the part of Konoha that was never fully restored after the Kyubi attack. It's a mess of broken buildings and unsprung traps just waiting to take your heads off. He grinned as a few more faces joined the nervous ranks. The second test is simple. Each member of your team will be given a bell. Your goal is to reach the old Umbu headquarters at the center of the training ground. Sound simple enough? Wrong. You need to provide 6 bells at the door to get in. How you get those bells is up to you. There are a few scattered around the training ground itself, but not enough for all of you. Failure to provide the bells after 3 days and your team will be disqualified. All 3 members of the team must be present to pass on to the next round. After making sure everybody understood, he grinned again, producing a set of documents. You all also need to fill in these liability forms. From this point on in the exams, killing is allowed. He said it with a grim, sunken face which only darkened as he saw a few genin smirk at this. He despised people who made light of death. It was nothing to be laughed at. Dismissing his own feelings and hardening his heart, the Jonin passed out the forms, giving each team their bells as he did so. Get to the gates around the training ground. The test will start in 15 minutes. Good luck. He shook his head at the determined looks, wondering which fools would still be fools by the end of this exam. Team Ensui were already racing through the training ground, determined to get through this stage as fast as possible. They needed to put some doubt in the minds of their future opponents, as any of the genin here could be. Naruto already knew that the last stage of the Chunin exams were straight-up fights. It was hardly a secret. After all, it was fairly hard to hide the massive celebrations and tournaments every 6 months. Ensui had even taken the group to the last Chunin exams final to give them an idea of what they would be up against. They tumbled and ducked under some rubble, following the path Itachi's Sharingan pointed them in. They were using the Jujutsu's ability to spot even the most minor details to track another team, a rather heavy-footed one in Itachi's opinion. They had been running for a good 15 minutes before they picked up a trail, and now they were racing through the rubble that made up the training ground to get to the other team. Naruto took another surveying look around, noting the pure destruction that littered the enormous area. It made him shudder to think that one creature, no matter how powerful, had managed to do all of this. It was especially bad considering the fact he now contained that creature within himself, knowing the ancient beast was just biding its time before it escaped. Finally the group came to a silent rest high up in a somewhat stable building that hadn't taken too much damage. Below them, apparently making plans of some sort, were another genin team. Naruto absently noted their headbands marked them as Suna Shinobi as he quickly made a few hand signs to his team. It was times like these he was glad Ensui had seen fit to teach them the standard Umbu sign language. Once he got 2 nods of approval, Naruto grinned before cracking his neck and walking off the edge. He dropped down right in the middle of the 3 genin, making sure the impact of his drop was enough to crack the already weak floorboards below them. They were so surprised that he had already stuck one of them directly between the eyes before they could react. Hey! The next one to cry out received similar treatment as Naruto suddenly disappeared, reappearing behind the shocked genin as he cracked him roughly on the back of the head. He cursed when the boy disappeared in a cloud of smoke only to be replaced by a pile of rubble from nearby. He dodged backwards suddenly, avoiding the closed fan that was ready to take his head off if he hadn't. Suddenly he was put on the defensive as the boy continued to swing his fan like a club, hoping to catch Naruto with the metal edge. Hold still, you leaf asshole! He was surprised when Naruto just chuckled, stopping his dodge midway and just standing up. The Suna genin just smiled wickedly as he brought his massive fan around for a large swing. Finally wizened up, I see. Little brats like you aren't cut out for chinin. Naruto just shrugged, stowing away those infuriating words into the deep recesses of his mind. The Suna genin brought his fan down in a hard, fast swing, only to pass straight through Naruto's body. Huh? Clone. He jumped back in confusion only to find his legs trapped as he slowly began sinking into the ground. The sky above him warped and twisted, becoming a blood red. His eyes bulged wider as he looked up, noticing a bright spot in the sky that slowly became larger and brighter. His last waking thoughts as he brought his hands up to shield his eyes were filled with horrendous images of his own death before he blacked out from the illusionary pain. Above him Naruto just sighed as Itachi walked up behind him, holding out the bell from the genin Naruto had hit first. You know, it's a lot less fun when you just put them under a genjutsu. Itachi said nothing, just motioning over to where Shisui was engaging the last conscious opponent, the two going back and forth with taijutsu. A long time ago Shisui may have found the much older boy difficult, but with his Sharingan and practice sparring against Naruto he was easily countering the boy's every move and retaliating harshly. Finally the last Suna genin dropped to the ground, too injured to carry on. Damn you, what the hell are you three? Shisui smiled sinisterly as he reached down to grab the boy's bell, unwisely hanging from his belt. We're Team Ensui, don't forget it. In a last burst of energy the Suna genin grabbed the bell off his own belt and held it out in front of him. Fire release, Phoenix Flower Jutsu. He spat a single weak fireball at the bell, but it was enough to melt the thin metal, rendering the bell useless. He smirked spitefully one last time before passing out from the pain running through his body. Shisui just cursed as he watched the molten metal that used to be the bell sink into the ground, kicking the unconscious Suna ninja in irritation. Sore loser much? Naruto just shrugged as the three of them sat around the small camp area the Suna shinobi had set up. Well, now what? Shisui shrugged once more, the two of them turning towards Itachi expectantly. The Uchiha thought for a moment, looking around them at the training ground. The only other option is to find another team and get their bells, unless we want to waste time slogging through the training ground to find one of the single bells the proctor mentioned. Naruto straightened his spine with a grin. Who said we have to do it? He formed a single hand sign as 5 more of him suddenly appeared in poofs of smoke. Shisui just looked at the clones with a small amount of exasperation while Itachi raised an eyebrow. How exactly are clones going to help us here? Naruto grinned broadly as he suddenly threw a kunai at one of his clones. Both Uchiha were amazed when the other Naruto effortlessly caught the thrown weapon by the handle. Not just clones. Shadow clones. Naruto quickly created several more and sent them all out to scout for either more bells or more teams. Each redhead saluted before disappearing in a burst of speed. At this rate they would have the bells no problem. When did you learn that? It was Shisui who asked, still amazed by the fact Naruto could create solid clones. They could have so many applications. Naruto just rubbed his head sheepishly, realizing he forgot to mention his new technique to his friends. About a month ago. Both Uchiha glared at their friend, rather annoyed he had failed to mention this technique to them. Remember how I have trouble with the regular clone jutsu because of my chakra reserves? Ensui-sensei said this would be a good alternative because they require a lot more chakra. His teammates just nodded at that. With their Sharingan activated they couldn't even tell the difference between the original and the clones. They're also pretty useful because they can transmit information back to me when they dispel, so I guess their main purpose is recon. Again he received nods, the logic was sound and the applications opened up even more. Could you teach us? Naruto just shrugged as he reached into his pack, withdrawing the scroll Ensui had given him. Sure, I pretty much have it down. He passed the encrypted scroll to Shisui, who looked over it almost with glee, already thinking of all the things he could do with it. Itachi gazed more coolly at the scroll, his mind running through a few thoughts. What happens if you put too much chakra into one of the clones? Naruto just blinked as he looked at Itachi. I don't know, it's never happened before. Why? Itachi just shrugged as he returned to looking at the scroll with a critical eye. No reason, just an idea. Naruto hummed thoughtfully at his friend's musing. Itachi was never satisfied with a jutsu until he found a way to tweak or personalize it to his preference. He was oddly predictable. Suddenly a clone dropped down in their midst, looking ever so slightly singed as it panted breathlessly. Everybody smiled though when the artificial redhead reached into its pouch and withdrew a single gleaming bell. Whoa, what happened to you? The clone just sighed as it dispelled itself, giving Naruto a sudden influx of information that made him shiver. The Jonin who set this place up was a freaking sadist. He shuddered again before the three of them got up, Shisui putting the shadow clone scroll away. Alright. We better get moving, no doubt there will be some teams setting up around the Umbu headquarters for ambushes, the longer we wait the more time we give them to prepare. After nods of acknowledgement from his teammates the three of them set off again, racing towards the center of the training ground. Chapter 8, New Challengers. Naruto couldn't help the splitting grin that overcame his features as he stared around at the enormous crowd of people gathered. They were all here for him. Or, at least, that was how his slightly inflated head was thinking at the time. In truth, many of the people gathered in the enormous stadium had come to watch all the prospective Chunin fight. For many, it was the highlight of their year, for others it was a good time to relax or get some time off from work. Many would splurge their savings on the pot, the weeks leading up to the event filled with speculation on who would win. There were many nobles and high-ranking people of the elemental nation's political system interspersed with the crowd, many of their pockets lined with tickets. The fire daimyo was even present, sitting in a specifically constructed box for him and any of his invitees. They were here to see the new crop of talent so that they could get a better idea of the various villages' strengths for when it came time to hire shinobi. Finally there sat the Hokage up in his own platform, smiling down at the single Konoha team that had made it this far. 4 teams in total had made it to the final round, one from Tsunagakuer, another from Omegakuer and a third from Takigakuer. It had surprised many that the only major villages to make it to the finals had been Konoha and Suna, especially considering that teams from both Kiri and Kumo had entered. The news only made Hiruzen smile. He considered it a way to show that Konoha had not been weakened since the Kyuubi attack. Now all he needed was for the single leaf team to show off their abilities to reinforce that notion. A hush overcame the crowd as a single Jonin made his way into the main ground of the arena, smiling happily as if he was walking to his favorite restaurant, not about to initiate a fight. He stopped in front of the 4 assembled teams who had also stopped chatting amongst themselves. He smiled again, making Naruto think he seemed far too happy for the position he was in. It actually creeped him out just a little. From the way his friends' faces turned, they were thinking the same thing. Alright guys, time to show what your villages are made of. He got a few grins from the Ame team at that, which in turn only brightened his own smile. Now, contrary to past years, we felt that the number of people who made it through didn't quite warrant a preliminary round. However, there are still enough of you that one-on-one fights could take the majority of the day. Instead, so we don't bore our kind patrons and nobles, we'll be having team fights, 3-on-3. A few of the Genin's eyebrows rose at this while once again the Ame team grinned deviously. Alright, first up will be Konoha and Ame, then we'll have Suna against Taki before the winner of each match face off against one another. Remember, the fights will go on until I stop them or all the members of one team are unable to continue. Like the last round, killing is alright here, but only if necessary. No need to go and scare all the people who came to see you fight, right? He finished his semi-question with a sickeningly sweet smile that seemed all too genuine, another reason all the genin found themselves taking a step back from the man unconsciously. Alright, Konoha and Ame stay here, the other two teams will go to the competitors' box until this match is over. He grinned pleasantly again. Good luck guys and have fun. With nothing more he disappeared in a shunshin to the other side of the arena with his arm raised up. The two genin teams left in the arena looked at each other warily, taking in what they could of their opponent's abilities. You should have stayed in the academy, brats. I don't know how you made it this far, but you're no match for us. Naruto raised an eyebrow but smirked slightly as he turned away from the shouting genin, already having gathered what he could. The one who spoke seemed to be the pseudo-leader of the team, or at least, he was the brashest. He towered high for his age, dwarfing his two teammates with the muscles to match, clearly shown off with his ripped, sleeveless blue kimono. An umbrella was slung over his back. From the one encounter Team Ensui had with an Ame missing nin, they knew it was full to the brim with senbon. Other than that, he had no visible weapons. He could have more hidden away in his clothes and it was likely he was armed to the teeth. Naruto remembered a time when they had to fight against an annoyingly agile kunoichi from Kiri who had a tendency to hide her weapons in surprising and embarrassing places. So much so that she had eventually managed to give them the slip. To this day, Naruto and his team hadn't told anybody about that particular encounter or risk a heavy blush. To the right of the leader was a much shorter girl who nonetheless carried the same smug air about her, the kind members of a powerful clan tended to hold. He was just lucky Shisui and Itachi weren't like that or his time as a genin would have been near unbearable. She wore a flowing robe that, due to its impracticality in movement, probably made her a genjutsu type. Naruto couldn't help noticing though that beneath her rather haughty attitude she was rather beautiful with her flowing black hair and large green eyes. Finally the team was complemented by an average-looking boy to their leader's left. However, Naruto knew better than to assume somebody's abilities based purely on appearance. The way his fingers subtly twitched towards his many pockets led the redhead to believe he was eager to begin. His overall appearance gave Naruto the idea he was the up-close and personal type, further helped by the boxing tape wrapped around his hands and lower arms. Other than that there wasn't much to notice: slightly unruly brown hair, calculative black eyes and clothes that were obviously more for practicality than anything else. He noticed that the other team were sizing them up just as much as he was and it made him wonder what they saw. He passed the thought over as he turned away, searching through the crowd until he spotted what he was looking for, Anko waving as she sat next to her sensei. The leader of the other team seemed so irritated by the redhead's lack of attention towards his opponents, that he began to draw a kunai out of his pouch. Luckily for him, at that very moment, the Jonin threw his hand down, initiating the match. As if a switch had been flipped in each of the three Konoha genin they suddenly span around, each unleashing their own barrage of kunai. The move was so fast and synchronized the Ame genin had some difficulty dodging, or in the case of their leader bringing his umbrella around to bat the projectiles away. Naruto absently noticed that thanks to her bulky kimono the girl managed to get hit by a glancing kunai thrown by Shisui. Not willing to let up in their assault the three took on a well-rehearsed and battle-honed tactic with Shisui and Naruto rushing forwards as Itachi stayed back, continuing to offer support with the occasional barrage of kunai. As they ran Naruto felt the trace amount of his opponent's chakra try to invade his mind in an attempt to put him under a genjutsu. He scoffed at the attempt, knowing that Itachi would be insulted if he didn't manage to break out of such a weak technique. Even as he thought this a few chains seemed to break out of the earth, each with a pointed tip solely aimed at him. Before the phantom implements could even get close he suddenly disrupted his entire chakra system before flaring it back, stronger than ever. Instantly, the illusion was broken, surprising the girl who had attempted to cast it. In her surprise she found it difficult to react, as Naruto closed the distance between them so hastily he seemed to vanish in a shunshin. Flickering back into existence right of her, he lashed out with a strong kick meant to hit her in the stomach. She blocked with both of her bony arms, once again surprised by the ferocity and power behind the blow that forced her back a little. However, what she really didn't expect was for Naruto to suddenly twist his body, using the leverage he already had on her body to raise his other foot and deliver a powerful scissor kick to her back. The girl cried out in pain, obviously not used to fighting up close like this. It was painfully apparent she had become overly reliant on her teammates. In a surprising move, she managed to spin her body around, catching Naruto off guard for just a moment. However, she missed her opportunity to capitalize on that instability. Naruto grounded his feet and disappeared in a burst of speed again. The girl just glanced around fearfully, trying to predict where Naruto would appear next without success. The last thing she saw was the second shadow merged with her own in front of her before a swift chop had her knocked out on the ground. Naruto sighed at the lack of fight the girl had put up, expecting more from his first real fight with people his own rank apart from his teammates. He glanced around to check on his friends, noting that Shisui was currently engaged in a hectic taijutsu match with their leader, while Itachi had already managed to subdue his opponent with a subtle genjutsu that had the boy believing he was fighting an army of undead. Content to allow his teammate to finish on his own, Naruto settled for tying up the girl as he watched Shisui fight from the corner of his eye. The Uchiha grinned as he ducked under another fast and powerful low, his Sharingan easily predicting the next movement, allowing him to subtly divert the next punch away from himself. Taking advantage of that and unintentionally borrowing a move from Naruto, he kept a hold of the loose arm as he spun around, lashing out with his fist at the last moment to catch the large genin in the side of the head. The Ame shinobi seemed dazed by the blow, but otherwise unhurt, made clear as he rushed back into the conflict. This time, he had brought out his umbrella, using the reinforced implement as a makeshift sword with surprising skill. It was enough to keep Shisui on the defensive and far enough away that he couldn't engage with taijutsu again. Naruto was about to go in and help his teammate before the Uchiha jumped backwards, hurriedly running through hand signs before finishing on Tiger. Fire release, Great Fireball Jutsu. To the Ame shinobi and spectators' surprise, an enormous ball of pure flames erupted from Shisui's mouth. It was massive, even for some watching Jonin, a truly impressive jutsu for one so young, even if he was an Uchiha. The single remaining Ame genin tried to appear unfazed as he opened out his umbrella. When the sphere of heat finally dissipated, the boy was standing in an enormous crater. His umbrella was slightly singed, his body sweating from the incredible burst of heat, but otherwise he was undamaged. Wow, pretty pathetic fireball if it couldn't even touch me. Now let me show you why I was the Rookie of the Year in Ame. The boy suddenly threw his umbrella high up into the air before jumping up and grabbing a hold of it again. Ninja art, rain blood drops. He began to spin furiously, looking like a small tornado as he continued to spin in the air, held aloft by the umbrella. Out of nowhere senbon began to rain down from him in numbers that seemed unlikely from such a small umbrella. Soon enough the entire arena was completely covered in the deadly metal implements, and as he landed, a little winded from the attack, he huffed. The arena was in complete silence as everybody looked at the 5 bodies lying on the floor. Even the other 2 Ame ninja hadn't been spared from the slaughter, they just lay there, bleeding slowly. Finally the last standing ninja grinned victoriously, a smile that was wiped from his face as all 5 bodies puffed out of existence. To his surprise, the Konoha team suddenly rose from the ground like it was water, suddenly very thankful, and Sui had seen fit to teach them the earth release, hiding like a mole technique. Naruto had the girl he was fighting slung over one shoulder while Itachi had his opponent in a similar position under his arm. You know, people like you, people who abandon their teammates, they're worse than trash. The Ame ninja was too tired to hide his annoyance at their survival as he huffed in apparent indignation. If they were weak enough to lose to brats like you, then they didn't deserve to live. Both Naruto and Shisui's eyes twitched dangerously while Itachi even seemed slightly riled by the comment. Before anybody else could react, Shisui vanished in a technique very well known to the Jonin in the crowd. Nobody was left unsurprised as he reappeared in a similar flicker of movement behind the Ame genin, crouched down in a ready stance. The other shinobi could only widen his eyes before he was launched into the air by a particularly vicious kick. He was rightfully frightened when Shisui flickered into existence above him, his leg raised and a snarl on his face. He brought it down in one fast kick that sent the unfortunate genin into the ground, a huge plume of smoke and debris following his impact. When it finally cleared, it revealed a very much unconscious and badly hurt Ame genin laying in a crater double his own height in diameter. After the stunned silence in the audience lasted for a few seconds, a single clapping Jonin soon turned onto an enormous round of applause for the entire Konoha team. Naruto just smiled happily even as the unconscious girl on his shoulder groaned, waking up from her forceful departure into the land of sleep. The three genin, each now carrying their own unconscious passenger, quickly made their exit to the competitor box to let the other teams fight. Naruto set his charge down against the wall as his teammates followed suit, only paying slight mind to the fight going on in the arena between the Suna Shinobi and the Taki Ninja. "So, how do you think we did?" Naruto just grinned at Shisui as the gesture was returned in kind. "I caught a glimpse of a few nobles as we left the arena, they looked pretty impressed." Shisui just smiled to himself at that, happy he managed to leave an impact on the judges. Itachi however seemed more thoughtful, his attention on the fight at hand as he tried to take in their potential opponents' abilities to prepare against them. As far as he could tell, the Suna Shinobi seemed to be using mainly earth techniques to subdue their opponents, one even was attempting to use some rather weak wind techniques. The Taki Shinobi however seemed to use solely water techniques, as befitting of the village they hailed from. "We shouldn't let the victory go to our heads, we still have other opponents to face before this is over." Naruto just sighed with a small smile on his face, looping an arm over his teammate's shoulders. "Come on Itachi, just enjoy the victory for once. If we can face a ranked missing nin, then a few genin shouldn't be trouble." Itachi sighed with his eyes closed. Sometimes, his friends were a bit too overconfident for their own good. "Just don't underestimate our opponents." Naruto gave a conceding nod with a quirk of his lips as the three turned back to the arena, only to find that the match was already over. Shisui's eyebrows shot up in surprise at the speed the match was fought at. Did anybody catch what happened?" He didn't see the two confused shakes his friends gave in the negative, his eyes glued on the scene. The Suna Shinobi lay on the ground, one completely unconscious while the other two were rolling on the ground, their eyes screwed shut in pain. Itachi narrowed his eyes, trying to examine what he could from the scene but drawing a blank. It looked like the effects of a flash bomb but more severe, and nobody in the audience seemed affected. Intriguing. Naruto had similar thoughts as he gazed down at the arena, watching with a critical eye as the Suna team was carried off. Finally, they were called up and each vanished, reappearing in the center of the arena in their own unique way. They found that arriving in two flashes of speed and a flock of crows had the tendency to put their opponents off. It seemed ineffective against the Taki Shinobi, but Naruto at least took that time to examine them. The one standing in the center reminded him of the other leader of the last group they fought. He was tall with broad shoulders and the muscles that spoke of a lot of intense training. However, he differed from the other boy as his face held none of that same arrogance, to the contrary he seemed quite kind and pleasant. He had a dull, dirty blonde mop of hair that almost hid his light green eyes. He wore a dark green shirt with a darker brown coat slung over the top, while his forehead protector was displayed in a similar way to Naruto's own. To his left and right stood two girls, one his age and one that seemed much younger. The first had a shock of white hair that stretched down her back with two long bangs that framed the sides of her face and complemented her shining blue eyes. She wore a light blue dress that seemed deceptively restricting for her line of work, as well as two boot-like sandals. The sleeves of her dress fanned out at her wrists, covering her hands and keeping whatever she was holding hidden. The last girl was the most intriguing, with green hair and the most startling pair of orange eyes he had ever seen. However, the more surprising thing was that she seemed even younger than him, possibly up to 2 years younger. In comparison to her teammates, she seemed rather shy, as if she didn't feel she belonged with them. Naruto also managed to catch that every time either of her teammates would look at her, it would be with either a dense glare or face-wrinkling anxiety. She looked up and for a brief instant their eyes met. Just looking into her incredible orange eyes he saw loneliness and pain, the likes of which a girl her age shouldn't have experienced. Was she trying to evoke his sympathy? He wouldn't relax around a strange team like Taki's now. Before he could dwell on it, the match was started. This time, instead of rushing in like they had before, the team decided to remain back and let their opponents come to them. Just as they hoped, the two older teammates rushed forward, both running through simultaneous hand signs before holding out their hands. Water release, water cutting sword. Instantly water coalesced from the surrounding moisture into two long swords made entirely out of water. Taken by surprise, Shisui had to jump back from their attack, having nothing he could use to defend against the larger boy. Itachi managed to jump in before his friend wound up in a difficult situation, his Tonto already in hand. Naruto on the other hand was grinning as he finally got an opportunity to test a technique he had been steadily working on recently. Running through his own hand signs, he extended his hand in a similar manner to the Taki Shinobi. Wind release, blade of wind. An almost invisible blade materialized in Naruto's hand, flickering slightly as he fought to stabilize his chakra in the technique. Luckily, his practice with the Rasengan greatly improved his control over the difficult shape manipulation technique. Unfortunately, he could still only hold it for a minute at maximum. He met the slash from the older female member of the team, the surprise evident on her face when he parried her attack with seemingly nothing. That surprise seemed to carry over as his blade just seemed to melt through her own, forcing her to jump back or be slashed across the chest. She looked at Naruto warily, trying to distinguish his blade from the surrounding air while Naruto tried not to show how difficult maintaining his technique was. Knowing he was running out of time, the redhead shot forward with his weapon extended. The Taki Kunoichi tried to block, but once again his own blade just phased right through her own, this time managing to nick her on the arm before she dodged away. Finally, Naruto released the jutsu, finding it too difficult to maintain his chakra flow any longer. In the brief lull he sent a glance to see how his friends were doing while the Kunoichi was making sure he still didn't have his wind blade. Itachi was currently in a fierce kenjutsu fight, finding it difficult due to the water-cutting sword's ability to simply pass through his own. He was having to use the flat of his Tonto to divert the blade instead of blocking it directly, which forced him to adapt his still rather fresh sword style. Luckily his Sharingan's predictive abilities kept him at his much more skilled opponent's level. Even now he was subtly weaving a complicated genjutsu to keep the man occupied. Shisui on the other hand had taken advantage of the fact the last member of the opposing team seemed to just be holding back, doing nothing. However, while he rushed at her with harsh and brutal, yet swift and precise attacks, she dodged every one. Her movements weren't particularly fast, but she had a strange airy grace as she seemed to almost dance around his blows. What made it worse for the Uchiha was that she wasn't even trying to counter-attack, so his Sharingan became less helpful. Returning to his own fight, he frantically moved to the left just as the Kunoichi thrust at him with her sword, barely dodging the attack before he sent 3 very swift punches along her arm. They weren't particularly damaging, but they were enough to disrupt her concentration and force her to abandon the technique. Now swordless, she was put on the defensive as Naruto came at her in a blur of red, moving much faster than her body could react. He was admittedly holding back, but he didn't want to seriously hurt the girl, just incapacitate her. Unfortunately, that gave her the opportunity to pull out a kunai. Getting close to her with pure taijutsu was now going to be much more problematic. He sighed as he pulled out a kunai of his own, drawing gasps from the few shinobi present who knew what the unique design meant. Of course, he didn't know the Hiraishin as his skills with seals weren't anywhere close to his father's level, but he used the kunai anyway to get a feel for them when that time came. He re-engaged the Kunoichi, deflecting or blocking her attacks but never offering any of his own above a simple scratch along the arm or a nick on the chest. Finally he grew slightly tired of the fight and disappeared in a blur of red again. This time, he just appeared behind her, lashing out with a curt kick to the back of her head. To his surprise, the girl in front of him simply melted into a puddle of water, the Kunoichi having apparently substituted herself as soon as he disappeared. She smiled victoriously as she appeared behind him, stabbing him in the side with her kunai. To her even greater surprise, the redhead in front of her also disappeared, but in a cloud of smoke. She was too surprised to defend the blow to the back of her head, dropping to the ground without any more fight. Naruto looked around again to check on his teammates only to find Itachi had subdued his in the same manner as before, while Shisui appeared to almost be dancing with his opponent. The Kunoichi he was fighting finally noticed that both her teammates had been defeated and jumped back, looking between the 3 of them fearfully. "Please, I don't want to hurt you." Shisui just scoffed in irritation as he attempted to close the distance between them with a shunshin. The mint-haired girl surprised him though when he appeared behind her. He was suddenly blown back by an unseen force while Naruto and Itachi looked on in amazement. Protruding from the girl's back were a set of insect-like wings that left many in the audience, save those from Takigaku, in awe and silence. With one quick flap she had sent Shisui flying back from the gust of wind she created. I'm sorry about this. She started to fly up into the air, keeping her audience and her opponents amazed that she could actually fly. Hiding in scale powder jutsu. Suddenly the girl exhaled an enormous mass of fine powder particles into the air, even as the three Konoha genin looked on in wonder. Suddenly all the particles seemed to glow before they caught the light, blinding all three shinobi in the arena yet somehow leaving the audience unaffected. Both Itachi and Shisui fell to the ground in pain, their sensitive jujutsu being overloaded by all the light. Naruto winced in pain as he closed his eyes, but didn't fall. Instead he focused on his ears, trying to find the kunoichi through his other sense. For her part the girl seemed surprised that Naruto could still stand and immediately targeted him first. However, to her even greater surprise, as soon as she flapped her wings once his head snapped around in her direction at the same moment his arm did. 3 of his kunai immediately shot from his extended hand with perfect accuracy. Everybody in the audience was left astounded as they looked on at the Taki kunoichi pinned to the arena wall with a kunai in each wing and one protruding from her thigh. When Naruto's vision finally returned he saw the proctor call the match, but not before the arena had once again erupted into a massive round of applause. He helped Shisui to his feet before doing the same with Itachi, both heavily disoriented by their temporary loss of vision. They looked around themselves, or at least the two Uchiha appeared to. In fact they still couldn't see properly. The crowds were in an uproar of cheering, praising their performance to the highest degree. The 3 of them just soaked it in with grins, even Itachi was smiling lightly. Naruto ran down the corridor of the arena, calling for the Taki shinobi to wait. The 3 young genin just looked around in confusion before spotting the approaching redhead. The min-haired girl, who was in the best condition despite her limp, turned to see what he wanted while her teammates just continued on. Naruto stopped in front of her, smiling slightly despite her outwardly cautious appearance. "Hi, I'm Naruto." He extended his arm out even as the girl just looked at it with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. After a few moments Naruto just chuckled, looking between the two of them. You're supposed to shake it." The min-haired girl's eye narrowed but she took his offered hand anyway, shaking it only once before pulling back. "Don't have much experience with people, do you?" He chuckled again, only meaning it jokingly, but immediately the girl's head lowered. The sadness was evident in her eyes despite her attempts to hide it. Sorry about that." The girl just shook her head as she extended her own hand. This time when Naruto took it she shook for slightly longer and even managed a weak smile. "No problem, it's Fia by the way." Naruto just smiled before Fia finally took her hand away. "So what did you want, Naruto?" The redhead suddenly became slightly more serious, shocking the Taki kunoichi with how quickly he changed his emotions. "I couldn't help but notice, back when you used that wing technique, your chakra it was, well." He struggled for the words, knowing it would probably be a touchy subject for the girl if her reaction to the handshake was anything to go on. "You're a Jinchuriki, aren't you?" Fu immediately took a step back, her eyes narrowed and posture defensive. "Why? What does it matter to you?" Her tone said it all. Any trust he had managed to garner in their brief exchange was gone, replaced by cautiousness and distrust. Quickly, Naruto waved a dismissive hand as he pulled up his fishnet shirt, channeling chakra so that his seal became visible. Fu just stared at it in recognizable shock before looking back up to his sheepishly smiling face. "You Yuri won too?" Naruto just nodded slightly grimly but managed to keep a small smile on his features. "I just wanted to check on you, we have to stick together, right?" Fu just nodded dumbly before blinking herself out of the slight stupor that overcame her. I have to catch up to my friends, but, if you're ever in Taki I guess." Naruto just nodded in understanding, his smile growing slightly. "Likewise." Fu managed to broaden her smile ever so slightly before she turned around to walk off, taking one last look over her shoulder at Naruto before jogging off to catch up to her team. Naruto watched her leave before sighing. He probably could have handled that better, but it turned out alright in the end. He had been sincere when he told Fu he only wanted to check on her. He hadn't simply sat idle since finding out what he held within him. He had researched Jinchuriki and what he found had not been encouraging. Most were used as weapons while others were driven insane by their tenants. It was generally not a pleasant existence, especially considering many Jinchuriki were seen as the biju they contained and hated for it. Luckily for Naruto, It had been his father's wish that he be treated as a hero for what he contained. While it didn't quite extend that far, most didn't look at him any differently for what he held. He guessed it helped that he wasn't a baby when it was sealed, or the people would have nothing to compare his behavior to. Hey! There you are, Naruto. He turned only to get tackled by a flying hug from a purple blur. Oh, hey Anko. He said in a pleased murmur. She sat on his chest, straddling him with a grin as she poked him in the forehead. That was pretty impressive, Mr. Chunin. Naruto just chuckled, accepting that fact that Anko probably wasn't going to get off of him anytime soon. Anko, you know that just because we won we aren't necessarily going to be made Chunin. Anko just scoffed with a playful smirk. As if. After that performance, how couldn't you get promoted? Naruto conceded a small smile before poking the straddling girl in the stomach. Just remember that'll be you next year. He was briefly saddened when he remembered the training trip Anko was about to leave on, but he covered it well. She finally let him up and the two began to make their way out of the arena corridor to find Naruto's team and go celebrate their victory. However, as soon as they did, an Umbu operative dropped from the shadows, startling both of them. Naruto Namikaze, a message from Lord Danzo. The redhead Jut looked at the scroll the masked shinobi offered before taking it, allowing the Umbu to once again disappear into the shadows. Danzo? The guy who's in charge of Umbu? What does he want with me? Anko just shrugged as the two continued on, with Naruto's eyebrows disappearing further and further into his hairline the more of the scroll he read. That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.